They thought the mountain road was empty that morning, just a frozen ribbon disappearing into the white fog of the Great Smoky Mountains. Then a massive elk staggered out of the trees, its antlers rising like a broken crown, its breath trembling in the winter air. Michael Carter slammed on the brakes, thinking it was starving or lost, until he saw the tire around its neck. Packed with mud, ice, rusted wire, and years of pain, it dragged the animal down like a curse. Michael should have driven away. Years ago, fear had made him leave another wounded creature behind, and the memory still followed him like a shadow. But this elk did not run. It simply looked at him, exhausted and silent, as if the forest had sent its wounded king to the only man haunted enough to stop. Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and be part of the journey. Now, let's get into it. Winter lay over the Great Smoky Mountains like a white, breathless spell, and the road near Cataloochee Valley curved through the trees as if it were afraid to wake the forest. Michael Carter drove with both hands on the wheel, though the truck was old enough to know the road better than he did. He was 38, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped from years of lifting crates, with a square, tired face, dark blonde hair cut too short by a cheap barber, and a rough beard that never quite became handsome, no matter how faithfully it tried. His blue-grey eyes had the habit of looking at things too long, as though every shadow might be hiding a memory. Most people in Waynesville knew him as a quiet delivery driver who showed up on time, said little, and helped carry heavy boxes without being asked. They called him dependable. Michael privately thought that was a polite word for a man who had learned to live small. Years earlier, he had volunteered with a wildlife rescue group, until one winter night broke something in him. A young black bear had been caught in a snare near a creek, and Michael, afraid of making the wrong move before help arrived, had waited too long. By morning, the bear was gone, not into the woods, but into the kind of silence that does not forgive easily. Since then, he had avoided animal calls, back roads after dusk, and anything that looked too much like a second chance. But grief, like a stray dog with muddy paws, had a rude way of following a man home and sitting on his chest at night. That morning, the forest seemed especially ancient. Snow clung to the branches of hemlock and oak, bending them low like old priests in white robes. Mist drifted between the trunks, soft and grey, hiding the slopes beyond the road. Michael's heater coughed more than it warmed. A half-empty coffee cup rattled in the console, and a stack of undelivered packages slid gently against the passenger door whenever the truck turned. He was thinking about nothing important: fuel prices, a loose belt under the hood, whether the diner still served biscuits after 11, when something huge moved inside the fog. At first he thought it was a fallen tree sliding down the bank. Then the shape lifted its head. A massive bull elk staggered out from between the snow-heavy trees and stepped directly into the road. Michael slammed the brakes so hard the truck fishtailed, tires hissing over the icy asphalt. The vehicle stopped less than 15 feet away. For a heartbeat, man and beast faced each other in the middle of that frozen morning, both breathing hard, both looking equally surprised that the world had not ended. The elk was enormous, at least 700 pounds, with a dark chocolate-brown neck, tan body, and winter fur thick enough to hold clumps of snow along his shoulders. His antlers rose wide and proud, a branching crown fit for some forgotten forest god, though one tine was chipped near the tip. He looked mature, perhaps 7 or 8 years old enough to have survived hunters, storms, rivals, hunger, and human foolishness. Yet there was nothing triumphant in him now. His ribs did not show badly, but his strength seemed drained, leaking from him with every breath. His eyes were deep black, glossy with pain and intelligence, and when Michael looked into them, he felt the strange, uncomfortable sensation of being judged by something older than language. "Easy," Michael whispered, though the windows were still up. "Easy, big guy." The elk lowered his head slightly, then jerked it back up with a sharp, broken sound. That was when Michael saw it. Around the animal's neck hung a tire, or what had once been a tire, before the mountain claimed it, filled it, cursed it, and turned it into a collar of punishment. Rusted wire looped through part of the rubber. Frozen mud packed the inside. Pine needles, bark, small stones, old leaves, and ice had gathered there until the thing looked less like trash and more like a black iron moon that had fallen around the elk's throat. Each time the elk tried to bend down, the wire pulled tight and bit into the raw groove beneath his fur. A thin thread of blood darkened the snow under his chest. Michael's stomach turned. The forest suddenly seemed too quiet, as if every bird, squirrel, and sleeping root had stopped to watch what he would do. He switched off the engine and sat frozen behind the wheel. The old fear rose at once, quick and familiar. This animal could crush him. One swing of those antlers could open him like a paper sack. One panicked kick could break his ribs. He was alone on a winter road with no proper gear, no training recent enough to trust, and no heroic music playing in the background. Only an aging truck, bad coffee, and a heartbeat making a fool of itself. The sensible thing was to call someone and stay inside. The cowardly thing was to drive around the elk and pretend the fog had swallowed the problem before he could name it. Michael had done something like that once, and the memory still wore claws. The elk did not charge. He did not flee. He stood trembling, steam rising from his nostrils, the tire dragging at his neck like a sentence passed by careless hands. Then he looked at Michael. Not wild, not tame, but unbearably tired. In that gaze, Michael saw no accusation. That was worse. Accusation he could have defended against. Hatred he could have understood. But this was need, plain and quiet, placed before him like an offering. Slowly, Michael opened the truck door. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to bite his lungs. His boots touched the icy road. The elk watched him, sides heaving, crown lifted against the pale sky. Michael raised both hands, empty and shaking. "I'm not leaving," he said, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to the elk, the mountain, or the ghost of the bear he had failed. Not this time. And for the first time in years, the man who had built his life around avoiding old pain took one careful step toward it. Michael Carter kept one hand raised toward the elk and reached for his phone with the other, moving as slowly as a man handling glass in a church. Atlas watched him from the middle of the snowy road, his massive chest rising and falling, each breath leaving his nostrils in pale clouds that curled through the fog like smoke from an altar. The tire around his neck shifted whenever he moved, grinding against the raw place beneath his winter fur. Michael dialed the Great Smoky Mountains ranger station with fingers that refused to obey him the first time. When the call connected, his voice came out rough and smaller than he expected. He explained the road, the valley, the elk, the tire, the rusted wire, the blood. The woman on the line told him to stay back, keep his engine off, and wait for a ranger. "Don't try to remove it yourself," she warned. Michael almost laughed, but there was no humor in him yet. He had already learned long ago that good intentions could turn deadly when fear dressed itself as caution. He ended the call and looked at Atlas again. "Help's coming," he said. "That's more than I gave the last one." The words slipped out before he could bury them. The elk did not understand English, of course, but pain had its own old language, and for one strange second, Michael felt as though Atlas had heard the shame beneath the sentence. Snow tapped softly against the truck hood. Somewhere beyond the trees, a crow called once, and then thought better of it, as if even gossip had no place in such a solemn morning. Michael remembered the water bottle rolling beneath the passenger seat. He opened the truck door wider, leaned in carefully, and pulled it out along with a folding knife from the glove box. His hands shook so badly the plastic crackled beneath his grip. He cut the bottle in half, sliced his thumb slightly, cursed under his breath, and then apologized to the elk as though Atlas had been offended by the language. Blood from Michael's thumb mixed with melting snow on his knuckle, a tiny human wound beside the great suffering standing before him. He poured water into the bottom half of the bottle, and set it on the road several feet from Atlas, then backed away. The elk stared at it. Hunger and thirst moved across his face, not like animal instinct, but like a starving kingdom remembering rain. Slowly, Atlas stretched his neck downward. The tire tilted, the rusted wire tightened. A wet, red line appeared beneath the dark fur. Atlas flinched backward with a short, broken groan that seemed far too gentle for such a large creature. Blood fell onto the snow in 3 bright drops, red as berries in a fairy tale gone wrong. Michael's throat closed. "No, no, no," he whispered, useless as prayer spoken after lightning. Atlas lifted his head high again, trembling, unable to reach what his body needed most. The water sat untouched at his feet, clear and innocent, almost cruel. That was when the ranger truck arrived, its tires crunching slowly over the icy road. A white and green Park Service vehicle emerged from the fog and stopped a careful distance away. Ranger Emily Johnson stepped out, and the winter seemed to recognize her. She was 35, tall and lean, with the practical strength of someone who had carried injured creatures, lost hikers, and other people's panic without complaint. Her skin was fair and wind-chapped at the cheeks, her brown hair tied low beneath a dark green knit cap, and a few loose strands clung damply near her temples. She wore a forest green winter ranger jacket dusted with snow, dark field pants tucked into mud-stained boots, and leather gloves worn smooth at the palms. Her face was not soft in the easy way, it was calm in the earned way. Years of working in the Smokies had taught her that nature was neither cruel nor kind, only honest, and that humans were often the ones bringing curses into sacred places and calling them accidents. Emily did not rush toward Atlas. She studied his stance, the position of his ears, the tension in his shoulders, the angle of the tire, the groove cut beneath his neck. Her hazel eyes narrowed, not with fear, but with grief held on a leash. "He's been carrying this a long time," she said quietly. Michael nodded, though the motion felt mechanical. "He tried to drink. He can't." Emily looked at the red drops in the snow, then at the water, then at Michael's shaking hands. She noticed everything. Rangers did. But she did not ask him why his face had gone grey, or why guilt sat on him heavier than the winter coat on his back. There were wounds people carried like hidden snares, and Emily had learned not to yank at them just because she could see the wire. Instead, she said, "You did the right thing calling." Michael looked away. Praise felt like a coat that belonged to another man. "I waited once," he said, barely above a whisper. "Too long." Emily's expression changed only slightly, a small shadow crossing her mouth. She knew enough not to demand the story. "Then don't wait alone this time," she replied. Atlas stood between them and the trees, his antlers shaking faintly beneath the weight of exhaustion, the tire hanging from his neck like a black moon nailed to a king. He could have charged. He could have vanished into the timber and taken his suffering with him. But he stayed, breathing hard in the falling snow, as if some ancient bargain had been made on that road. One wounded beast, one haunted man, one ranger with steady hands, and a forest holding its breath to see whether humans could undo the harm humans had made. Dr. Sarah Miller arrived 23 minutes after Emily called her, driving an old, silver veterinary SUV that looked as if it had survived mudslides, hailstorms, angry raccoons, and at least one very personal disagreement with a pine tree. She was 46, short and solidly built, with weather-brown skin, sharp grey eyes, and dark auburn hair streaked with silver, pinned messily under a wool cap. Her face had the stern angles of a woman who had spent too many nights telling frightened people the truth. Yet when she stepped toward Atlas, her voice changed completely, lowering into something warm, careful, almost motherly. Sarah had worked with injured wildlife for nearly 20 years, and everyone in the Park Service knew two things about her. She did not waste words, and she did not forgive human carelessness easily. Years ago, she had lost her younger brother in a winter road accident caused by a truck swerving to avoid a deer. Since then, she had carried a complicated love for wild animals and a sharper understanding of how quickly mercy could become tragedy if done foolishly. She looked at Michael only once before turning to Emily. "How long has he been standing?" Emily answered, "At least half an hour since I arrived. Longer before that." Sarah studied Atlas through the falling snow. The elk's breath came rougher now, and the tire shifted against his neck, with every tremor in his legs. "We sedate him here," Sarah said. "No chasing, no forcing. If he bolts into the trees with that thing cutting deeper, we may not get a second chance." Michael swallowed hard. The word second chance struck him like a small hammer behind the ribs. Sarah prepared the tranquilizer with movements so precise they seemed almost ceremonial. Emily stood to one side, calm but ready, one gloved hand lifted. Michael stayed behind the truck door, useless and unwilling to leave, feeling like a boy watching adults repair the sky. Sarah moved closer, speaking to Atlas in a low murmur. "Easy, old king. Nobody's stealing your crown today." The dart went into the thick muscle of Atlas's hindquarter. The elk flinched, stamped once, and for a terrible moment Michael thought he would charge, but Atlas only shuddered and held his ground. 5 minutes passed, then 7. The mountain wind pushed snow across the road in pale ribbons. At last, Atlas's eyelids softened, his head lowered slightly, and the rage of pain in his muscles loosened into heavy stillness. He remained standing, but the storm inside him had dimmed. Sarah approached first, then Emily. Michael followed only when Emily nodded. Up close, the tire was worse than Michael had imagined. It was not merely hanging around the elk's neck, it had become part of his suffering, packed tight with frozen mud, pebbles, bark, pine needles, and green-black moss. Rusted wire ran through the rubber like an old trap, pretending to be trash. Beneath the elk's fur, a deep groove circled his neck, red and rubbed raw in places, dark and calloused in others. "My God," Emily whispered. Sarah's jaw tightened. "This didn't happen last week." She pushed 2 fingers under the edge as carefully as she could and frowned. "It's heavier than it looks." Michael reached toward the packed mass. "Can we pull some of it out?" Sarah glanced at him, measuring not his strength but his fear. "With your hands, slowly. If he shifts, step back. No hero work." Michael almost smiled. "I'm not exactly famous for hero work." Emily heard it, but again she did not press. Together they began scraping at the frozen earth inside the tire. The work was miserable. Michael's fingers went numb within minutes, even through his gloves. Chunks of mud broke loose like pieces of old pottery. Pine needles came out in clotted ropes. Small stones clicked against the asphalt. Emily dug with a flat tool from Sarah's kit, her face set in fierce concentration, snow collecting on her shoulders. Sarah checked Atlas's breathing every few seconds while trying to expose the wire. "This thing is like concrete," Michael muttered. "Concrete would be kinder," Sarah said. "Concrete doesn't hide steel." She pulled a heavy pair of cable cutters from her bag and positioned them around the visible wire. Her arms tensed. The handles squeezed halfway, stopped, and trembled. She tried again from another angle. The cutters slipped with a sharp, metallic snap, and Michael's heart jumped into his throat. Atlas stirred, a deep groan rolling through his chest. Emily placed both hands against his neck, steady but gentle. "Easy, Atlas," she murmured, using the name Michael had whispered earlier without asking permission, as if the elk had already earned it. Sarah stepped back, breathing hard through her nose. "No, this won't do it. The wire's embedded too tight, and the tire's reinforced. If I keep forcing it, I'll hurt him worse." For a moment, no one spoke. The forest seemed to lean closer. Michael looked at Atlas's half-closed eyes and saw the awful patience of an animal that had endured more than any living thing should. "Then what?" he asked. Sarah was already reaching for her radio. "Fire department, hydraulic cutter." Emily nodded once. "I'll coordinate road closure." The next 20 minutes stretched like a punishment. Michael kept one hand near Atlas's shoulder, not touching unless Emily allowed it, watching the elk's breathing grow slower and heavier. Every rise of that huge chest felt like a borrowed coin from heaven, and Michael feared the mountain might demand repayment before help arrived. Then, through the fog, came the low rumble of an engine. A red fire rescue truck rolled into view, bright as a cardinal landing in a graveyard. Jack Thompson climbed down from the passenger side, carrying a hydraulic cutter nearly as large as a sleeping child. He was 42, tall and barrel-chested, with a broad, square face, sandy hair flattened under his helmet, and a thick moustache that made him look permanently prepared to argue with bad weather. Jack was famous in the nearby town for making jokes during emergencies, not because he lacked seriousness, but because he had once frozen during a fatal house fire early in his career and had sworn afterward never to let fear be the loudest voice in a crisis again. He looked at Atlas, then at the tire, then at Michael's pale face. "Well," Jack said, lifting the enormous cutter with both hands, "I thought today was going to be a cat-in-a-tree kind of morning. Turns out we've got ourselves a king wearing a tire." For one brief, cracked second, Michael laughed. It escaped him before grief could stop it. Then Atlas's knees trembled, his breath hitched, and the laugh died in Michael's throat as everyone moved closer, realizing the king's time was growing thin. The wind grew teeth. It came down through Cataloochee Valley in hard white gusts, shaking snow from the hemlocks and sweeping it across the road until the asphalt looked less like a road than a frozen river. Atlas stood in the center of it, enormous and half-dreaming, his antlers lifted but no longer proud in the easy way of wild kings. The tranquilizer was fading. Dr. Sarah Miller saw it first, the faint twitch along his shoulder, the tightening at the base of his jaw, the slow return of fear behind his heavy black eyes. "We're losing our window," she said, and her voice cut through the wind with the clean edge of a blade. Emily Johnson moved instantly to Atlas's head, one gloved hand near the base of his antlers, the other steady against the dark fur of his neck. She did not grab him. She anchored him, the way a lighthouse anchors sailors without ever touching the sea. Michael Carter stood on the other side, close enough to feel the elk's heat through the cold air, close enough to see the raw, red groove beneath the tire, where skin had been rubbed nearly bare. His chest felt too tight, as if the mountain had put its own invisible tire around him. Jack Thompson crouched in front of the black rubber collar, hydraulic cutter in both hands, his moustache dusted white with snow. For once he had no joke ready. The tool looked powerful, almost mythic, like something a blacksmith might have forged for cutting chains from giants. But the tire resisted even before the blades touched it. It was slick with ice on one side, swollen with packed mud on the other, and braided through with steel that had no business being around the neck of any living creature. "I need a bite point," Jack muttered. Michael pointed with a shaking hand toward the rough section where they had dug out the dirt. "There! The edge is torn open." Jack nodded. "Good eye." The words should have warmed Michael, but he barely heard them. Atlas shifted his weight, one hoof scraping the road. The sound was small, but everyone froze. Sarah lifted her stethoscope briefly against the elk's ribs, listening beneath fur, muscle, weather, and fear. "Still steady," she said, "but work now." Jack placed the cutter's jaws against the exposed ridge of rubber. Emily leaned her shoulder carefully into Atlas's neck, speaking in a low murmur. "Easy, big boy. Easy, Atlas. Let us finish this." Michael laid one hand flat against the elk's shoulder. The fur was coarse, damp, and warm under his palm. He felt the great animal tremble, not with weakness alone, but with the terrible patience of something that had survived because survival was the only choice given to it. Michael lowered his head. "Come on, buddy," he whispered. "Just a little longer." He had not prayed in years, not properly, not since the bear cub, not since he decided heaven had probably stopped taking calls from men who hesitated. But the words that left him now felt close to prayer, rough and unpolished, carried up through snow and breath. Eased the handles. The cutter groaned. The rubber compressed, then slipped. Jack cursed, reset the jaws deeper, and tried again. This time the tool caught. A long metallic squeal rose from the tire, high and ugly, like some trapped spirit protesting its eviction. Atlas jerked, and Michael pressed his palm harder against the elk's shoulder without thinking. "Easy, easy!" Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the breathing. Emily's hands stayed steady. Jack's face reddened with effort. The cutter sank through rubber, found the steel wire hidden inside, and stopped as if it had struck bone. Jack clenched his teeth. "Come on, you stubborn little demon!" Then came the first crack. It snapped across the valley, sharp enough to startle snow from the branches. For one glorious second, Michael thought it was over. But the tire sagged only slightly, still holding its shape, still clinging to Atlas's neck like a curse that had lost one finger, but not its grip. Jack exhaled hard. "Not enough." Sarah glanced at Atlas's eyes. They were opening wider now. "Again," she said. Jack shifted to the opposite side of the collar, choosing another exposed place where the mud had been carved away. Michael could feel Atlas waking beneath his hand, feel the muscles returning to command, feel panic beginning to gather like thunder behind the animal's ribs. "Please," Michael breathed, though he did not know whether he meant Jack, God, the mountain, or the elk himself. Jack drove the cutter into the second point and squeezed with everything he had. The tool screamed. The steel resisted. Emily's jaw tightened. Sarah counted the breaths under her breath. Then the hidden wire gave way with a brutal pop. The tire split open. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Emily and Sarah pulled the two halves apart with careful hands, lifting them away from the wounded neck they had imprisoned for so long. The pieces dropped onto the asphalt with a heavy, dead thud. Atlas's head rose half an inch, as if some invisible giant had finally stepped off his shoulders. Michael stared at the broken tire lying in the snow. It looked smaller now, uglier, stripped of its power. Jack hooked one half with both hands and lifted. His arms strained. "Lord," he said softly, "this thing's a monster." Michael remembered the spring scale in his truck, the one he used for weighing equipment and hunting gear, back when he still pretended hobbies could outrun memories. He fetched it, and together they weighed the two halves. Nearly 18 kilograms. Jack looked at the number, then at Atlas, and his face lost every trace of humor. "I wouldn't wear that backpack for 10 minutes, he said. He wore it through winter after winter. The wind moved through the trees. No one laughed. The broken tire lay between them like evidence in a trial where all of humanity had been called to answer. The broken tire lay on the snowy asphalt like the body of a defeated monster, and for a moment no one moved, as if the mountain itself needed time to believe the curse had truly ended. Atlas stood between them, huge and trembling, his head lifted higher than before, though his legs still carried the heavy confusion of the tranquilizer. Without the black ring around his neck, he looked almost unreal, like a forest king suddenly restored in the middle of a roadside battlefield. But freedom had not arrived without wounds. Beneath the thick brown fur of his neck, the skin was rubbed raw in a deep circle, red, swollen, and angry where rubber, wire, ice, and time had carved their cruel signature. Dr. Sarah Miller stepped forward with her medical kit, her short, sturdy frame bent against the wind, grey eyes sharp with focus. She did not celebrate yet. People liked endings too early. Animals often paid for that impatience. "Hold him steady," she said. Emily Johnson moved close to Atlas's head, calm as a winter pine, one hand near his cheek, the other resting lightly against his neck. Michael Carter stood opposite her, his broad shoulders tight beneath his coat, one palm hovering near Atlas, as if afraid even kindness might hurt. Jack Thompson remained by the tire halves, no joke on his lips now, his big hands hanging at his sides like tools that had done all they could. Sarah poured antiseptic over a cloth, and began cleaning the wound. Atlas flinched, a low shudder passing through his massive body. Michael flinched with him. The raw skin looked painful enough to make a grown man curse heaven and several county officials, though Atlas only breathed, endured, and stood. Sarah worked carefully, removing bits of dirt trapped near the torn fur, then spreading a thick healing ointment along the groove. "No deep infection that I can see," she murmured, almost to herself. "He's lucky." Emily looked at the broken tire. "Lucky is doing a lot of work today." Sarah gave one dry nod. Lucky had help. Michael lowered his gaze, unable to accept the words fully. He had spent years believing his hands were good only for being too late. Yet here they were, red from cold, shaking and clumsy, still somehow part of the reason Atlas was breathing free air. Sarah prepared an antibiotic injection and gave it swiftly, then stepped back to watch. The sedative was thinning now. Atlas blinked more often. His ears twitched. His nostrils widened, as if the world had returned with too many smells at once. Snow, rubber, blood, human sweat, pine sap, fear, mercy. He shifted one hoof, then another. Everyone backed away except Emily, who eased back only when Sarah lifted a hand. "Let him choose," Sarah said. "No crowding him." Atlas stood very still. Then, slowly, with the seriousness of a priest approaching a sacred bowl, he lowered his head toward a shallow ribbon of meltwater running along the roadside. Michael stopped breathing. The old terror seized him again, the wire, the blood, the painful jerk upward. But there was no wire now, no black collar dragged against the wound. Atlas lowered his muzzle all the way to the water and drank. The sound was small, almost ridiculous after such a battle, just water being pulled from a roadside puddle by a thirsty animal. Yet to Michael, it rang louder than church bells. Atlas drank long and steadily, each swallow seeming to pull life back into him from some dark place where it had been waiting. He drank as though remembering that the earth still offered gifts. He drank as though the snow itself had melted only for him. Michael laughed once, a broken sound that turned into a sob before he could stop it. Jack glanced at him and pretended very politely to study the trees, because even large firefighters with heroic moustaches sometimes understood the sacred etiquette of not noticing a man crying. Atlas lifted his head at last. Water dripped from his muzzle. He turned his neck left, slowly, then right. His ears flicked forward in surprise. He tried again, wider this time, as if testing a door he had expected to remain locked forever. Then he walked toward a moss-covered tree at the edge of the road and pressed his neck against the bark. He rubbed once, cautiously, then harder. His eyes half closed in such pure relief that Emily actually smiled. Sarah exhaled, the sound half science, half prayer. Jack whispered, "Well, Your Majesty, that itch had a 2-year appointment." This time, the small laugh that passed through them did not feel disrespectful. It felt like warmth returning to a room after a funeral candle had gone out. Atlas stopped rubbing and turned back. For several seconds he looked at them. Sarah with her kit, Emily with snow on her ranger jacket, Jack beside the broken tire, Michael standing apart with tears drying cold on his face. No one spoke. Between human and animal, there was no promise, no tame affection, no fairy tale bow. There was only breath in winter air and the quiet understanding that mercy had crossed the road and survived. Then Atlas turned toward the trees. Step by step, he entered the forest, his hooves sinking into clean snow, his antlers rising above the underbrush like a crown returned by the old gods. He did not run. He walked with the dignity of one who had suffered and still remembered how to belong to the world. Michael watched until the brown shape vanished into white fog and dark trunks. Only then did he look down at his empty hands. Something inside him, something frozen around the memory of a bear cub and a younger man's fear, had cracked open with that tire. He had not erased the past. No one was granted such magic. But perhaps redemption was not a door that opened all at once. Perhaps it was one wounded creature drinking without pain, one man choosing not to leave, one set of hoofprints leading back into the forest, while another life, human and trembling, finally began to follow. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive with thunder in the sky or angels standing in the road. Sometimes it comes quietly, through falling snow, trembling hands, and one wounded creature brave enough to step out of the forest and ask for help. Atlas carried that tire for years, but on one winter morning, God placed the right people on the right road at the right time. Michael thought he was only saving an elk, but in truth, something inside him was being saved too. His guilt, his fear, his old pain. All of it began to break apart, just like that heavy ring of steel. And maybe that is how grace works in our everyday lives. We may not always see it. We may be tired, broken, ashamed, or carrying invisible burdens no one else can understand. But God still sends small chances for us to choose kindness. A phone call, a helping hand, a moment when we stop instead of passing by. So, if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson you took from Atlas and Michael's journey. And if you believe stories like this still matter, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories of courage, mercy, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your heart to be a light for someone in need. Sometimes, the miracle begins the moment we choose not to walk away.